All right, so let's take a look at the Atlanta Reign. So, like I said, almost all on team option. Funny Astro under contract. So this guy was on a slightly different setup to a few other people as well. Originally, when he was coming into the league, he had the ban because of boosting, and then he was a two-way player from the academy team as well. So he's on a slightly different setup. Nothing particularly interesting, though, about the Atlanta Reign. This I would consider to be the most default setup possible, right? Like a lot of the expansion teams, I would expect, before I read this announcement, I thought that almost every expansion team would have a similar situation to this, where the players signed 1+1s for the first year because you don't know whether they're going to be any fucking good, so you want the option in the second year to cut their asses and not have to guarantee their pay. But also, you want the option to continue if things are doing well. That's from the team's point of view, that is what you would like to do, right? So that should be, I think Atlanta Reign should be considered like the kind of default option, unless you're a situation like the Vancouver Titans where you know that you're going to have a lot of success anyway. But let's scroll down, because Boston Uprising is where things start to get fucky very, very quickly. So, Boston Uprising have a reputation for being a bit of a farm team, right? They cycle through players. They don't pay their players an incredible amount, but they always scout players from regions where they wouldn't have got into the Overwatch League anyway. So you can't call them like manipulative or anything like that, because realistically, these players like, for example, Alemão or Persia would never have been scouted for the Overwatch League if it hadn't been for the scouts on the Boston Uprising. These guys would be earning pennies playing in Brazil or playing in the Pacific region as well. So the Boston Uprising has a different way of kind of going about things. So what is interesting from this? So I think the first thing is that AimGod is a free agent, whereas you've got Persia on team option. So I think this explains quite a bit of the reason why AimGod was sat on the bench for the majority of the second half of the season. Once the way that the Boston Uprising works is they're trying to sell their players, but you can only sell players if they're under a team option or under a guaranteed contract. You can't sell a free agent because they're not under contract with you anymore, right? So unless they would get a buyer for AimGod before it got to the end of 2019, they're not going to make any money on AimGod. So at that point, when they're looking towards the future, there's no point peddling out AimGod to show how good he is, because you're not going to get any value by selling him. And also, their option in the future is to go with Persia, because presumably AimGod is not staying on the team. Boston Uprising, a lot of these players that played in the 2018 season do not want to stay on the Boston Uprising, and I don't think the Boston Uprising want them either. You know, Jeff has had his own kind of attitude issues and the reasons that they benched him earlier on. Now, I don't believe that the reason that he was benched in the second half of this season was because of attitude issues. I think it was also like the coaches factoring in the future and trying to rely on Persia and build him up, because they could sell Persia if he had ended up being pretty good, but the team wanted to go in a different direction, or next year they can use him as well. So with your season completely destroyed anyway halfway through this year, you may as well focus on the future rather than trying to keep peddling out AimGod. Yeah, team option can be traded or sold, and free agents are out of their contract, is essentially a good way of summing it up. Yes, VIO. VII. But let's see, because what you find interestingly here is that there are 4 players that got picked up for the 2019 season who are under contract still. Now, what does that mean? When they signed at the beginning of 2019, they didn't sign 1+1s. Right? You think back to these guys all signed at the beginning of 2019 as well. These guys are on team option. Like I said, the most default option would be to sign a 1+1. Presumably, these guys didn't sign a 1+1. Either that or they renegotiated halfway through the season, but why the fuck would that happen? The most logical conclusion, as far as I can see, is that the Boston Uprising signed these 4 players on 2+1s or possibly even longer contracts, but that seems unlikely. They're probably on a 2+1 contract with the team. So what does that mean moving forwards? If the Boston Uprising wants to rebuild, it should be around these 4 players, because they have to pay their contracts no matter what, because they're under contract. Alternatively, they could sell them to other teams, and then if, for example, they sold Color Hex to Toronto then have to pay Color Hex's salary, right? So that's a way that the Boston Uprising can get rid of players and get rid of their salary and move them off their budget sheet, is by trading them to another team. And you trade the contract to the other team, so the other team has to pay for it. It seems likely to me, though, that at least these 3 players will be built around. I know because I've heard it from players that are close with the team that Huck really likes the way that Fusions leads the team, and I expect the Boston Uprising to build around Fusions next year. And for my money, Blase's leadership and Color Hex's potential make them worth building around as well. Now, Axiom, I've heard good things about, but didn't really get much playtime. Is he worth keeping on the bench? Probably. Will Huck possibly try and sell him because that's what Huck does? Very possibly as well. So you look at that, and that really kind of indicates to me the core of what the Boston Uprising are going to be doing in this offseason. Now, you look at two other people that were signed in the 2019 season, Alemão and Persia, and these guys are on team option. So these guys signed different contracts to this core four. I'm going to call them the core four of Boston, right? Because these are the guys that presumably signed 2+1s. Alemão and Persia signed presumably 1+1 contracts because they would be guaranteed for the 2019 season, and yet they're on team option for 2020. What that seems to indicate to me is that they thought that picking up somebody from the Brazilian region was a risk, so they didn't want to keep them on a longer contract, and also signing someone from the Pacific region was a risk. Now, was this a risk that worked out? No. Alemão saw almost no playtime over the course of the 2019 season, and Persia saw playtime, but was dog shit. So I think a very reasonable decision to not put them on the longer contracts that Axiom, Blaze, Color Hex, and Fusions are on, because they are not going to be able to get value out of them if they were still on contract at the moment. Persia was their Zen Ana player. Yes, he looked better on Ana, but his Zen was just tragic. Having said that, the entirety of the Boston Uprising were tragic. So, maybe not so much of a knock on Persia, but he didn't look like he was up to snuff. So, there you go. So, what do we know from this? I would expect, given that Boston Uprising have the opportunity, but not the obligation to pick up this option in 2020, I can't really see them picking up the option for Persia or Alemão. I would expect them to become free agents on November the 11th, because the Boston Uprising have until November the 11th to decide whether or not they want to contract them in the 2020 season or to release them as unrestricted free agents. It would be my strong suspicion that people like Alemão and Persia, and possibly other people that they didn't get much value out of, like Stella, for example, would end up becoming free agents at November the 11th. So there could be a whole wave of new free agents on November the 11th. That's the other thing to keep in your head. Now let's go down to the Chengdu Hunters, because this looks really boring because they're all under contract, but I think it's actually a little bit interesting. So, actually, sorry, I'm just going to scroll back up here as well, because there was a point to make about RCK before we move on to the Chengdu Hunters. Now, RCK was on Dallas, and this contract that got traded to Boston was Dallas's contract with RCK. So this is our first example as we scroll down the list of a traded player that the contract had to be picked up. Okay, so Dallas notoriously pay their players very well. Some would say too well. I would say too well. They also have players that are on guaranteed long contracts, but we'll get to the shitfest dumpster fire that is the Dallas Fuel later on. But for RCK, he was traded with note in the middle of the 2019 season. From what I've been told, RCK's contract was higher than notes, right? So what that means when they get swapped is that the Boston Uprising now have to pay more to have RCK than when they had note. So there was also a lump sum of money attached, as far as I'm aware, to the trade. So that Boston got RCK, the obligation to pay a higher contract, and a lump sum that made up for it. Now, this lump sum, as far as I'm aware, was actually a little bit more than the extra amount they would have to pay for RCK's contract. So Boston Uprising, as far as I'm aware, made a profit on the trade, but it wasn't an enormous profit. And when you look at how the trade actually occurred and think about the value of those players, I would say that they should have stuck with Note, because also Note is just a leadership figure and was, for God's sake, the only thing holding the fucking Boston Uprising together. So, a poor trade overall. But that's another interesting thing to take a look at. Now, Huck has also come out and explained why he did that trade, and it's because they didn't know that 222 was coming, and they thought that the off-tank would need more flexibility, of which RCK had demonstrated more flexibility at the time. So there was a thought process. It's not like Boston Uprising are idiots. Certainly, the way that they have run their team so far would not lead you to believe that they're idiots. They came to third place last season with a team that was nobody thought would do anything. So, a clever team. This is not a knock on Huck, but that trade was poop.